Hi, this is Łukasz Langa. I've been asked on Twitter how my static site generator works for my blog. I've said that it only took 3 days to write and it's just a couple of hundred lines of code. So people started, being curious about like, hey, is this really that easy? So this, in fact, is an excerpt from a talk I gave at PyCon Belarus to show you essentially how it's done, how I produced it from scratch. But I wouldn't be myself if I didn't actually also smuggle some of my type annotation worldview with this. So this talk is actually also about convincing you to treat type annotations as your friend. Of course, the more type coverage there is in your project, the better, right? The bigger the system that you are developing and the larger your team, the easier it is to see the value of type annotations. But I really do believe that type annotations make coding better at any size. But really, if you disagree, you don't have to watch this talk because you probably already do the following, right? You test all paths, not just lines in your code base. You have full API documentation that never gets outdated. And you refactor code every time that it provides a clear improvement, right? Well, if you're doing that, I suspect you are either Donald Knuth or a co-maintainer of a prominent open source project with maintainer count greater than 1, or, well, a liar. I guess if you think there's another possibility, go write your own talk. We, the Python developers, actually do see the day-to-day reality of non-perfect tests, unclear and outdated API docs, and avoidance of refactoring due to risks of breakage. So I could preach to you as much as I want, but I do believe it's better to see for yourself how type annotations actually make coding better as a regular day-to-day experience. But before we get to this, just a very short summary of why I think they're important. So type annotations provide a form of testing that removes an entire class of errors from your code base. Type checking also provides a form of API documentation that does not go out of sync with your sources. And finally, it allows you to do safe refactoring whenever you feel like there is an opportunity for architectural improvement. So without further ado, we're gonna now start developing our project. At some point, I'm gonna switch my shirt and, you're gonna notice a little difference in the white balance and everything. That's the part I already gave as the PyCon Belarus talk. Don't be alarmed. For now, let's just create an empty project. Let's just call it SSG because that's how a static site generator is called. We are using Poetry because it's a very nice way to manage a project and its dependencies. I'm also using VF, stands for virtual fish, to maintain my virtual environments, to be outside of my source tree. That is useful to keep all my code in Dropbox, so it's synchronized between my computers. So yeah, now we can actually start adding dependencies. So first, let's just add some developer efficiency things, MyPy and Black. That solves itself relatively quickly, and now we can actually move to the dependencies that make this particular project tick. So they're going to be Markdown 2, a very flexible Markdown parser, Jinja 2 for templating, Beautiful Soup for making HTML transformations, Dateutil, and Rich for some CLI sparkle. All right. So given that we are already here, now I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio Code. So I opened the workspace file so that you can see that we have MyPy enabled. We are not using Flake8 today. We have PyTest integrated, and so on and so on. I hope the font is big enough for our use today. Hopefully you're all in front of monitors, which is a little different than actually being at a venue, looking at, a screen very far away. All right, so we're going to be using Python 3.9 today because it provides plenty of new important features for typing. And we're going to be using the future import for annotations, which provides us with forward reference support. So we're going to be using the dunder main py file to actually start our application. So that only invokes some main function. We're already red, meaning, oh, we need to import main. That import is still red because that function does not exist. All of this functionality is already given for us by the type checker, which only now the error disappeared is happy because it sees that in fact everything is okay, the import is successful, we can invoke our main function. Well, we're not even doing the typical if dunder name equals dunder main. Well, because it is dunder main and its name is always going to be that. Okay, so moving on. Where are we going to take the data for our website? From my notes database. I keep a lot of notes over the years, like there's literally thousands of them, and they're being stored by my application in a text bundle format. They are literally just directories, and in those directories you have markdown files, JSON metadata, and some assets. But the important thing for us are those hashtags that you see in line 20. If we have a specific file that does have a specific hashtag, we are going to include it in the website. The one that we're looking for is hashtag public. That means I can still pretty much use my application, which is FS Notes, like written by a guy from Ukraine, like very, very, very good application, highly recommended. It's open source, but it is pretty much a replacement for bare Evernote or whatnot. Like the only difference is that you control your data. I like it a lot. I use it extensively for any note taking, but here I can also just now publish parts of my notes as a personal website. So this same note will look like this on, the internet. So in the end, the only difference is that we have some nice headers, some categories and whatnot, but the content is still exactly the same. So the main structure of the program, looking at the bird's eye view, is to prepare some output directory where we're gonna create our static site, render the static pages first. So for example, like, the index, maybe some other pages that we want, then render the dynamic content. We're gonna render the sitemap that will help search engines, index us, and maybe symlink to the latest output that we have. This is also useful because we can then, just fire up a web server to look at our changes without having to relink every time. The type checker is very unhappy about the situation that we just drew right now because neither the functions exist nor the arguments to the functions. So let's slowly start fixing that. So we have function stubs like the prepare output directory. It's going to take a path. It doesn't return anything. We are going to have a render static pages some function. It just takes 2 paths. Also doesn't return anything. For now, for the time being, none of those functions do. Render content is a little more exciting because we have some notes. We're just going to use the notes type for now. We're going to see in a minute what that is. We copy that one because essentially it's the same signature that the previous one. And symlink, again, is going to be just some path that we pass it, and that's it. So at least now the type checker is happy with us using functions that exist, but it's still very unhappy with both the types that we use and the arguments which don't exist yet. So first, let's solve the mystery of notes. Notes are going to be is going to be a dictionary of tags that are valued with a set of paths. In other words, what that means is we're gonna be keying the dictionary by some strings that just happen to be tags, and the values in that dictionary are gonna be the files, the path to the files where those tags exist, right? As you can see on lines 8 and 9, I essentially created types that the type checker didn't need. I could just say string. I could just put the dictionary of string to set of path in both render content and render sitemap. So why did I do that? Well, the aliases are for people, are for humans, so that they're contextual. We can now better understand what is going on. Here we're using path. So now we're pretty much happy with the type situation. We need to fix the last problem where we have right now. So arguments in the main function. So first of all, the source and target directories. We're probably gonna get them from some command line arguments. So let's literally name our function that, get CLI args. And that doesn't really accept any arguments for now, but returns a tuple of 2 paths. Having that, we can actually make the logic work for this. There's not really much to discuss here. So for the time being, we're just going to use ArcBars, which is the built-in library for command line parsing. Good enough. The program is called SSG. We're gonna need 2 arguments, right? The source argument, where to find notes of type path, and the same with target. We're gonna add a -t. It's gonna be where to put the website, right? Okay, again, a path. And now we only need to actually parse the thing into some args blob and unpack the values from that blob to return them. All right, cool. Looks like we're done with this function. And right now, the only errors that MyPy is seeing is on line 39 and 40. We still don't know where the notes come from. Let's fix that right now. So to get the notes paths, we actually have to look through all of my notes and actually look for public notes per tag. Right? So what we need to do is create a function that is going to actually search through all of the Markdown files and, just gather a result correctly with a dictionary where we have tags and then sets of paths containing those tags. So for this purpose, we can use whatever pathlib already supports, which is globbing. I very much like this feature of pathlib. As I said, we are using the text bundle format, so we are only looking for folders that end with .textbundle. We find Markdown files in those folders, find tags in them, and if public is not found, we continue. We are not interested in those nodes. Those are probably some of my laundry lists and whatnot, who'd be interested in reading that. But for the rest, we're gonna actually start with a default set, add the current text file path to it, and as such, we're gonna get the result. Oh, but MyPy was unhappy with us not providing the type. Why? Well, most of the time, in fact, in all of our variables so far, all of our names so far, we did not have to provide explicit type annotations. The result is different. It's just an empty container, so it's not at all clear what the intended, things inside are supposed to be. So MyPy is working within the philosophy that it better ask you so that all of the other operations that you're doing on that container can be validated against what you explicitly specified. Of course, it would be possible, and other type checkers sometimes do this, to infer what the type of that particular dictionary is by looking at operations done on it. The problem with that is that if those operations are incorrect, you're gonna have false negatives. You're not gonna warn the user that they did something fishy. So we're done with that. We need to actually implement find tags. How are we gonna do that? Having the path to a file, I guess the simplest thing that we can do is just use some regular expression, right? Like, let me just paste one, which is essentially very simple, no spaces and hashtags. We are not accepting escaped hashtags. And now we're just finding all. Oh, of course, we need to do the import first. Let's do that first. After we satisfy the import, we can go back to our function, and now it's still unhappy. Find all returns a list, but we actually specified that we're returning a set. For the use that we have currently on line 43, doesn't really matter whether it's a set or a list. However, we specified we are gonna return a set. So if we actually ran this without fixing our return, it would still work, but the expectation wouldn't be fulfilled. So later on, if some other use of find tags would actually depend on it being a set, for example, using some unions or other set operations, we would fail. That wouldn't work anymore. So here, MyPy essentially just told us like, hey, future-proof this, make sure that you're actually returning what you claimed you are going to return. Like, worse yet, sometimes if you wouldn't actually make it a set, other users of find tags might start relying on the fact it's a list, in fact. And what then? Now you have this very weird situation where your claimed behavior is different from the behavior that is actually relied upon. All right. The problem with our find tags is that it is a little naive. So since this is, a Markdown document, you can have links. So in URLs, you can also use hashes. It would now find hashtags that aren't there. To fix this, actually, let's use an HTML processing library like Beautiful Soup and remove all block quotes, right? So those probably don't contain any hashtags that are meaningful for our purpose. And same with code blocks. Of course, hashes are very often important in source code pieces, but they are not hashtags in the sense that we are using them here in this program. So having fixed that and obviously satisfying the import, now we can start using this find tags correctly. Obviously, like in all steps before, there is always some squiggly line saying you haven't written that yet. And in our case now, we are in front of a very simple but crucial step to convert our Markdown file into HTML. So if we actually go there and do this, you're going to see that this is essentially just an invocation of some Markdown library. First, we need to read the text, which I just did in a single line. Again, love pathlib, and we're just we're using a Markdown function. I pasted in a bunch of extras. I love the Markdown 2 library because it essentially allows for a lot of niceties that developers like code friendly, which removes headers that are, like lacking spaces and removes underscore for emphasis. And so on and so on. You can read up on the Markdown 2 project's website what all of those extras mean. I actually use them in production, so why don't you just look at what I have, The footnote return symbol uses another trick that I personally use often in source code, which is that you can actually refer to Unicode characters by their Unicode names in Python. I think that's pretty cool. So now, let's prepare the output directory. For now, it's just a stub. Let's replace the stub with an actual behavior. Like obviously we're gonna first be creating our directory. And now we just need to copy some static files, right? Some CSS and whatnot from some source, static to some, what? Oh, but our API is different. We actually accept a single path, but here we have source and a target. Well, let's just change the API then. And now if you look at the right of the file, you're gonna see that at the bottom, MyPy is already unhappy with us because we actually are using the prepare output directory function wrong. So now we can easily change this. And all of this without having to run, without having to write explicit unit tests for the behavior. This sort of thing is fixing itself, essentially. So now our output directory is prepared, and we can move on to the first rendering of a thing, right? So to render static pages, again, let's click through. Now we can make this behavior work. So first, we're gonna use another function that doesn't exist yet, which is just render page. Like for now, like single page to render index HTML. So let's write that. We're gonna be using that plenty later, so it just makes sense to make it work. Obviously, there's gonna be some template name, again, some path to write to, and some keyword arguments that we're gonna just pass to the template. We're gonna be using Jinja2 for this purpose. So let's open file for reading. Again, this is a form that Pathlib allows me to do, like I like it a lot. And now let's say we're gonna have some environment for templates, and we're just gonna get the template of the name that the user of that render page function provided. So yeah, later on we just need to render that template with the provided keyword arguments and write it back. So templates, we need to define this right now. So as I said, we're using Jinja2, and we're gonna be actually providing some environment from it that needs a loader. So again, we're gonna be providing the loader in a second, and we are turning off auto escaping. Don't do that for any actual active websites, but for our purpose, that makes our life much easier because our Markdown files are in fact provided by ourselves. So they're not, you know, I mean, if end user input, they're our input, they're safe. So the loader, just a regular file system loader from templates directory and current directory. Current directory is a really nice pattern in Pathlib. Again, I like to use it like this. It's much clearer than the old OS path shenanigans. Right. So now render page is ready. It's happy on the right of the file. We don't need any red dots. We don't see any red dots. So looks like we can actually pretty much start rendering things. But before we get there, we actually need to add some templates and static files. So the static files are just, you know, some CSS. This is not the point of this particular talk, so we're not going to be covering that at all. And there's some Jinja2 templates. So for example, this index that we're rendering is already extending base HTML and just has a bunch of blocks, and that's essentially it, right? And the base, again, it's very regular HTML with Jinja2 blocks. The main block is right here. Yeah, the file looks pretty much the same as my production website. So yeah, having all of this, we can now run our, you know, budding application and see what's going to happen. So we're executing this as a module and get a very, very ugly attribute error. Non-type object has no attribute glob. Static typing, you just betrayed us. What happened? Well, let's see. If we actually do --help on our tool, we're going to see that there are two arguments, well, actually options, right, that we can provide to our program, but we don't have to. And what happens if we don't? Well, ArcBars just puts none in their place. That's the default value. We didn't provide any defaults. So ArcBars is the culprit here. Let's look at it. So we're adding the argument of type path, and we're adding the argument t of type path. We're returning a tuple of two paths. All should be good. So what's going on? Oh, S and T are any, meaning the type annotations for the ArcBars library are lying to us. The reason why that is that ArcBars is a library that predates static typing in Python by at least a decade, if not more. So it kind of builds the arguments that the user gave it by creating a random object and just stuffing it with attributes. This is not something that type checkers can easily analyze statically. So the maintainers of MyPy just decided to put any on the attributes of the ArcBars namespace object. This is obviously not very good for our purpose, and it caused a real-time problem. So you probably want to use a better CLI parsing library. In fact, the talk just after mine is covering exactly that. So you might want to stay for that. In the meantime, let us just fix the problem in the old-fashioned way. If any of the arguments is none, let's just loudly complain to the user, making options actually required. Required options, kind of a weird thing, but let's just assume, you know, for the purpose of this simplistic tool, purity, Unix purity doesn't matter. All right, so now executing the same thing actually tells us provide -s and -t. So we did that, and an entire 2 seconds later, we already have something generated. So we can now serve it, and we're just gonna use Python again for that same purpose. And boom, we actually see my cute face and a bunch of sentences about me. All right, that's pretty good. We can now actually start rendering content, which is why we are even here. But before we do that, let's create a bunch of helper functions that we're gonna need for this. Those are very, very, very utilitarian, like get the first non-empty line from a file. So we're gonna be opening our file and reading it line by line. And as soon as that stripped line is not empty, we're gonna be returning it. Otherwise, let's just return an empty string. We have a similar thing that just gets a title from a Markdown file. Let's use an optional string right now just to show you how it looks like. So we're using that function that we just declared before, first line, but we're actually checking whether it looks like a Markdown header. If it's Markdown header 1, then we're gonna be returning that as the title. And in another case, let's just return none. Okay, and another thing that we're gonna want for our tags listings is the first paragraph of the document. That way, the listings of our blog posts, right, are more interesting than just containing titles. So we're using Beautiful Soup for this purpose. Again, getting the first paragraph by just doing .p. If it's not none, then we're returning a stringified form of it. This time around, it is actually containing HTML, right? Before we used a get text, which stripped all HTML out and just, you know, left the text. Now we are returning entire HTML. So when we are actually going through a lot of the posts to somehow render them once in lists and in another case as the main piece of content on a particular page, we need to put them in some modal. So for now, let's just use data class. That's already supported by Python. It is pretty much sufficient for our purpose and pretty much tailor-made for static typing because it uses that for our declarations. So we have a bunch of metadata that you probably expected we would need, you know, some date times, some unique identifier, some title, lead, the entire text, a list of tags because we want them sorted, and a source to the file where we got all this information from. Might be useful, for example, to get assets later or something. So how to create this content? By default, with the data class, it provides us with constructor that just accepts all of those as keyword arguments. So that's nice, but it's not very convenient when we're reading a Markdown file. So let's create a new constructor, which is typically done by making class methods. So from path, given some path, we're going to return you a piece of content. So we're going to need stat for the, date times. And here I'm going to paste everything else because all those conversions actually take up a lot of time. So just in the interest of time, let's just do it like this. We see that MyPy is unhappy that our method doesn't look correct. In fact, I did forget the CLS, but also now that it reminded me that we need class method as well. All right, so here we fixed text to path because obviously text doesn't exist, but it's still unhappy with us. Why is it unhappy? Like, it looks so regular. Oh, because first HTML paragraph actually gets HTML in a string. So unlike all the other functions around it that you might be tempted to just regularly put path everywhere, actually we need to provide text here. So to actually fix this, we only need to get the text somehow, but we're getting it right in the line below. So let's just do some tiny refactoring, and now we're happy. MyPy is gonna approve our code, and we can start doing the actual content rendering. All right, so rendering content here is essentially doing two things. We need to render tag lists, which are essentially how you find content on the website, and the items, which are the actual blog posts. So first, we're going to have some stem of the tag that returns the hashtag because we need to actually put the listings in some files on the file system. Obviously, we don't want the hashtag character in those paths. So having that solved, we create that path and we can now start using it. So we create the directory and now we can start rendering pages. So yeah, rendering the page essentially is the same as last time, only now we are using the tag.html template, and we just provide it with a bunch of metadata that we made sure is there. All right. So that is already rendering our tags, and now we just need to go through all the content items to do the equivalent thing. So also to render pages for everyone. So first we just do a trick. We copy the entire tree of that item on the original source, like the notes, and then only render it in place. Copying it has this nice feature that we're gonna copy all the assets in. And in the Markdown file, those are relative links, so they will magically work. All right, so after just a bunch of typing, we're gonna have this pretty much done. Now we can use our item provided, and boom, boom. We are ready pretty much. This render content method is the longest, well, function is the longest one we have, but it fit on a single screen. So I'm pretty happy with that. All right, we still have a typo here. Let's fix that. And after this, we can actually run our SSG functionality and look at the resulting website. See, there's some movies, there's a listing, like actually looks pretty nice. We can go down. Oh, we still see our tags that were supposed to be just internal metadata for us, but they are now seen by the public. So let's do this as the last thing today. What we're gonna do is to actually fix the text as HTML function, right? Now that we read text from a file, we're just gonna use a regular expression that finds hashtags on their own in a line and substitute those hashtags with an empty string. Oh, but wait. Actually, we're using text as HTML in a function that finds tags. So if we remove the tags before, that will obviously break that use case. So maybe better let's refactor the signature of the function to accept text instead. Now we have little red dots telling us we're using this function wrong. So let's just copy our transformation, change the type of the function, and that is good. There's another red dot. Oh, that actual find tags use case. So we're fixing that with just a single line, read text, and we are done. All right, pretty cool. So what we did just now is we created a real world application in just 30 minutes. I mean, it's real world, I'm actually using it. And through type annotations, we avoided many mistakes that you otherwise have, and they would just slow you down. We didn't even import typing. And I hope the code actually, as you saw, was readable. We were able to refactor code as we went along, and thanks to the typing guarantees, it already found all issues with our refactoring for us. And the biggest bug in our code base was actually due to inadequate typing support. So it was in a third-party library, we didn't control that, but we still could squash it using traditional methods. So let me leave you with a quote from Guido. Guido said that I learned a painful lesson, that for small programs, dynamic typing is great, but for large programs, you have to have a more disciplined approach. It helps if the language actually gives you that discipline. This is what we're doing with static typing. You can reach me at łukasz.langa.pl. My name is Łukasz Langa. Thanks very much for watching.